Good afternoon, Division 2. We're done this book, Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. It was quite a challenging read in terms of the emotions it could provoke, especially at the end there. So a few of you have expressed interest in learning a little bit more about apartheid in Africa. So as promised, for those of you who wanted it, I'm going to read this last essay. It's not part of the story Born a Crime. It's just in addition, some history in addition to. So some of you expressed that you would like to hear this. It's written by several people, including Trevor Noah himself, as well as others. So if you're interested, here goes. Apartheid history. Trevor Noah's detailed history of his childhood demonstrates the extreme racism and prejudice that characterized life in South Africa during apartheid. Apartheid was a system of control with laws meant to keep Black people from rising up against white rule. Its principles were inspired by the racist ideals of Adolf Hitler. Under apartheid, people were treated unequally based entirely on race and the way they looked. Forced to live and work in complete separation from each other. This rigid policy of segregation and discrimination valued white South Africans over all other races. It lasted for more than 40 years, from 1948 to 1991. So 1948 is just a few years after World War II. 1991, just to give you an idea of when that is, I graduated from high school in 1995. So in 1991, I was about your age. The concept of apartheid originated with the National Party, a political group that was founded by white South Africans in 1914. 1914, so that's around World War I time. Most of its members were Afrikaners, an ethnic group descended from the original Dutch colonists of South Africa dating back to the 17th century. So we talked a little bit about colonization in class. Colonization is when the Europeans went to other continents and essentially landed there and kind of took over, including governing the place, and very often disrespected the native peoples of that particular land. So in South Africa, it was the Dutch that did that. The National Party gained support from white nationalists and promoted the idea that white people are racially superior, a notion that is both morally wrong and factually incorrect, as we all know. The party came to power in South Africa's 1948 election on a platform of segregation, at which point it established apartheid to solidify its rule. The first president was Daniel Francois Malan, or D.F. Malan, and he governed the country until 1954. During his time in office, he implemented most of the defining laws of apartheid. Black people vastly outnumbered white people in South Africa, but the National Party quickly realized it was necessary to find a way to overpower the majority as they wanted to maintain power. Apartheid was their solution because it used existing separations between people to make sure the white minority can control the non-white population. Under apartheid, this author's doing a much better job of explaining it than I attempted to in class. So hopefully you're listening here. Under apartheid, the South African government assigned people to one of 4 different racial groups: Black, white, colored, and Asian. And in brackets next to Asian, it says, which meant Indian and Pakistani. As we know, Asia is a pretty big continent and includes a lot more than those 2 countries. Black South Africans made up the majority of the country's population, further divided into different tribes with different languages, including Zulu and Xhosa. We talked Trevor Noah talked about that in those 2 tribes in the story. Swana and Sotho, among others. White South Africans were in the clear minority. Were the clear minority. Many were Afrikaners and spoke Afrikaans, a Dutch-derived language. I had a friend who grew up in South Africa and spoke Afrikaans. It's kind of a mix of languages. So it's kind of Dutch, but not really. kind of a mix of Dutch and English and other things. Colored people were mixed-raced people descended from ancestors of different ethnicities, including blacks, whites, and members of other racial groups. Like Afrikaners, most colored people also spoke Afrikaans because of an affinity with their white ancestors. Indian and Pakistani people were in a category of their own. Under apartheid, the government didn't just force people of different races to exist separately. They also treated the different racial groups unjustly. White South Africans under apartheid were treated as superior. Non-white people were treated as lesser members of society, with blacks considered the most inferior. They were often the target of appalling acts of violence and other atrocities. In many ways, as Trevor explained, the categories of apartheid didn't make any sense. It was an impossible system for police to enforce with complete accuracy because it relied heavily on profiling people based on their appearance. Remember that story about how him and his friend were caught on camera stealing, and he got off scot-free because his lighter skin reflected the light of the camera and he didn't look black. It's kind of a funny story, actually. Additionally, the system didn't represent the complexities of how people identified themselves, and the lines between groups weren't always clearly defined. For example, there weren't enough Chinese or Japanese people to necessitate forming another racial group, so the South African government arbitrarily lumped them into other existing categories. Although both ethnic groups originate from areas in Asia, Japanese people were considered to be white and Chinese people were considered non-white. In practice, apartheid appeared similar to the systems of segregation seen in other countries, as the United States, such as the United States, after the end of the Civil War. Both were characterized by blatant acts of inhumanity and rampant mistreatment of entire racial groups. Once slavery was officially abolished in the United States and blacks were granted citizenship and voting rights, many whites resented how blacks were designated as equal under the law. Therefore, even though black people were considered equal in legal terms, the fair treatment did not extend into daily life. While blacks technically had the right to vote, for example, the implementation of poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause meant that few could actually exercise that privilege. Yeah, so they were allowed to vote, but that didn't, they legally could vote, but that didn't mean they were able to actually go to the polls and make it happen. Particularly in the South, Black people faced widespread discrimination and mistreatment, and white people fought to maintain racial separation. From the end of the 19th century to the culmination of the civil rights movement, Blacks were forced to use different bathrooms, schools, buses, and other public facilities in the South. The regional laws that established this racial segregation were called Jim Crow laws. The term Jim Crow was a derogatory reference to African Americans, derived from the name of minstrel shows that were performed in blackface during the 19th century. And I'm going to end there for today, and we'll continue this history of apartheid next week. Hope you listened to that. The author did a fabulous job, explained apartheid and colonization better than I did, I believe. So let me know what you think, and I'll continue that next week.